The story we're about to discuss is one that no one ever hoped would take such a heartbreaking turn. A 3-year-old boy named Dawson Zamora, who had been fighting for his life for weeks after allegedly being brutally assaulted by his mother's boyfriend, has now passed away. His family confirmed the devastating news, and this tragic development has pushed the entire case into even more serious legal territory. What began as an abuse investigation has now become a potential murder case. Dawson's father, Darian Zamora, had been at his son's bedside throughout his fight for survival. For weeks, he updated the public, friends, and supporters, sharing Dawson's condition and the long struggle doctors were facing due to the severe injuries the little boy had suffered. Late last night, he posted a deeply emotional update, one that no parent should ever have to write. Along with a photo of himself holding Dawson for the final time, Darian wrote that his son passed away on December 7th at 10:42 a.m., which heartbreakingly was also Darian's birthday. In his post, he shared that Dawson's last breath became permanently connected with the day he came into the world. He described how his son held on to spend one final birthday with him, a message that has moved countless people online. This alone would be shattering, but the circumstances behind Dawson's injuries make the situation even more disturbing. According to investigators, Dawson had been under the care of his mother's boyfriend, Christopher Alexander, at the time of the alleged assault. What initially was reported as a fall quickly proved impossible based on medical examinations. Hospital staff found injuries on Dawson that were far beyond what a simple accident could explain, including severe head trauma, bruises in different stages of healing, and injuries that suggested ongoing abuse. Dawson's mother, Chelsea Berg, was also soon drawn into the investigation. At first glance, her social media presence painted the picture of a loving and happy mother, making the allegations shocking to many. But as evidence emerged, particularly text messages, authorities began to suspect that she may have known far more about the ongoing abuse than she initially claimed. Because Dawson has now died from these injuries, both Berg and Alexander are facing far more serious consequences. Prosecutors have already elevated the case, and both individuals may now be charged with capital murder, an offense that in Texas can carry the death penalty or life in prison without parole. As investigators continued piecing together how Dawson ended up fighting for his life, more troubling details surfaced. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident quickly evolved into a case filled with disturbing contradictions, questionable behavior, and evidence that pointed toward long-term abuse. According to documents obtained by local authorities, Christopher Alexander, the boyfriend of Dawson's mother, was the one who took the child to the hospital on October 14th. He had reportedly told hospital staff that Dawson fell and hit his head. He claimed that he had been in another room when he heard a loud thud. However, the injuries doctors observed told a very different and far more alarming story. Medical professionals quickly realized that Dawson's condition could not have been caused by a simple fall. They found serious brain bleeding, extensive bruises in various stages of healing, abdominal injuries, and trauma that suggested repeated harm over time. These findings immediately raised red flags, as they indicated a pattern, not a one-time incident. Police then questioned Dawson's mother, Chelsea Berg, about what happened. She told officers that she had left Dawson with Alexander early that morning and that everything seemed normal. She claimed she had no idea how such severe injuries could have occurred, but investigators soon discovered evidence that challenged her version of events. The first major breakthrough came from text messages exchanged between Berg and Alexander weeks before Dawson was hospitalized. In one message from early September, Berg accused Alexander of being reckless and hurting Dawson, describing bruises on the boy's face and jawline. In another message sent days later, she wrote that every time Alexander had been alone with the child, Dawson ended up injured. These messages painted a deeply unsettling picture. Not only was Berg aware of injuries occurring under Alexander's care, but she also continued leaving Dawson alone with him. The texts contradicted her initial claims that she had no suspicion of abuse. Adding even more concern, Alexander's background revealed a history of violent or troubling behavior. He had prior convictions for theft and unlawful restraint, and he was already facing a separate stalking case for which he reportedly wore an ankle monitor. According to Dawson's father, Berg knew about Alexander's record but still allowed him access to her son. 2 days after Dawson was rushed to the hospital, police arrested Alexander for injury to a child, stalking, and tampering with evidence. Berg was arrested the same day on charges of injury to a child by omission, accused of failing to protect her son despite clear warning signs. Both were later released on bond, until Dawson's death changed everything. As the investigation deepened, more information emerged showing that the situation inside the home was far more alarming than anyone initially realized. The text messages between Chelsea Berg and Christopher Alexander did not just hint at concerns, they revealed that Berg had repeatedly warned Alexander about the injuries Dawson suffered while in his care. These messages, now part of the official case file, offered evidence that Berg may have knowingly allowed a dangerous situation to continue. One message from September 9th was particularly unsettling. Berg described bruises on Dawson's eyebrow, face, and jawline, clearly suggesting that the boy had been hurt more than once. She accused Alexander of being reckless and said she was not blind to the injuries. Despite this, she continued relying on Alexander to watch her son in the weeks that followed. Another message dated September 18th revealed an even more alarming pattern. Berg wrote that every single time Alexander was left alone with Dawson, the child ended up injured. Her words, emotional, direct, and accusatory, showed full awareness that something was seriously wrong. Yet even after this warning, the situation remained unchanged, eventually leading to the day Dawson was taken to the hospital with catastrophic trauma. Investigators then turned their attention to Alexander's background, which raised additional concerns. His criminal history included previous charges for theft and unlawful restraint, and he was still involved in an ongoing stalking case for which he reportedly wore an ankle monitor. According to Dawson's father, Berg knew about Alexander's legal issues and even knew he wore an ankle monitor. Despite this knowledge, she still allowed Alexander to be alone with her son. It wasn't long before the legal consequences began to escalate. On the same day Alexander was arrested, Berg was also taken into custody. Her initial charges included injury to a child by omission, meaning she was accused of failing to protect Dawson despite clear warning signs. She later bonded out of jail. But as investigators compiled their findings, the medical reports, the bruises in different stages of healing, the text messages, the timeline, and the testimonies, it became clear that this was not a case of neglect alone. It was a pattern of repeated harm, missed opportunities to intervene, and a failure to act despite undeniable evidence. Then the most devastating development occurred. Dawson passed away. His death fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Almost immediately, the charges against both Berg and Alexander were upgraded. Late one night, a new mugshot of Berg appeared in county records, showing she was now charged with capital murder. Alexander's charges were also upgraded to capital murder of a child under 10, one of the most serious criminal offenses in Texas. With Dawson gone, the entire case shifted from severe abuse to a full-fledged homicide investigation, one with the potential for life sentences or even the death penalty.
With Dawson's death confirmed, the legal stakes for both Chelsea Berg and Christopher Alexander reached the highest possible level. Prosecutors swiftly upgraded the charges to capital murder, a crime considered one of the most serious in Texas law. Under Texas statutes, killing a child under the age of 10 qualifies a defendant for capital punishment, meaning both Berg and Alexander are now eligible for either the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole. As legal experts began analyzing the case, many agreed that the evidence against Alexander appeared overwhelmingly strong. Doctors had already stated that Dawson's injuries were consistent with repeated abuse rather than a sudden accident. The bruising patterns, the internal trauma, and the timeline aligned too closely with long-term harm. Even Alexander's behavior at the hospital, lawyering up quickly, refusing to elaborate on what supposedly happened, raised questions. Though prosecutors cannot legally reference his silence in court, it still formed part of the broader narrative investigators were examining. For Berg, the legal situation is more complicated. While she was not the alleged physical abuser, prosecutors believe she exhibited what they describe as deliberate indifference, meaning she allegedly knew the danger Dawson faced, yet failed to protect him. Her own text messages, which vividly described Alexander hurting Dawson multiple times, became key evidence suggesting she allowed the abuse to continue. Defense attorneys, however, are expected to argue that Berg was herself a victim of domestic violence, possibly manipulated or threatened by Alexander, and unable to leave the relationship safely. If her defense can convince a jury that she was trapped in a toxic and abusive environment, they may push for lesser charges, such as child neglect, rather than capital murder. Legal experts note that juries often view female defendants differently, especially when there is evidence of emotional control or abuse within the relationship. But while both defendants may end up with separate trials, since their defenses conflict and each is likely to blame the other, Alexander faces an especially uphill battle. If Berg chooses to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a plea deal, her testimony could become devastating to Alexander's defense. In cases like this, the prosecution's strongest bargaining chip is the death penalty itself. Removing it from the table can convince a defendant to accept a guilty plea in exchange for life in prison. Meanwhile, Dawson's father, Darian, continues to mourn the unimaginable loss of his young son. In his emotional public post, he thanked the medical teams who fought to save Dawson and the community whose support helped him stay on his feet. He now faces the painful task of raising Dawson's sister while seeking justice for the child he held as he took his final breath. The case remains active and continues to draw widespread attention. As prosecutors prepare for court and attorneys build their defenses, one thing is certain: the tragic death of 3-year-old Dawson Zamora has left a permanent mark on everyone who followed his heartbreaking story.